Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, the U.S. government is shut down.
President Trump threatening to fire federal workers and to cut programs and benefits, saying he can do things that are irreversible.
What's at stake, and how could President Trump use this moment to reshape the federal government? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Before we go on with today's show, I want to ask for your support. The Take is nominated for the Signal Awards in the Best Daily Podcast category, and Al Jazeera's True Crime Reports is nominated for Most Innovative Video Podcast and Best True Crime Podcast. Now, while we wait for the judges' decisions, you can help us win the listeners' vote. The links for voting are included in the episode's description. Vote and share. Thank you.
I'm surrounded by neighbors who are federal workers or federal contractors, and they absolutely have been dreading this day, worrying how long this will drag on, whether they'll be able to pay for their mortgages. There's federal workers, over 2 million of them all across the country.
The longer the furlough goes on, the more difficulty people will have making ends meet. Our people live paycheck to paycheck.
Can you imagine, you're going to go fight a wildfire and you know that you're protecting the communities and you're protecting the public and you're not getting paid for it?
We need the government to stay open so that we don't have to live off our credit cards, that we don't have to take multiple loans just to pay our mortgage, to pay our daily necessities.
I'm Heidi Zhou-Castro. I'm a correspondent for Al Jazeera English based in Washington, D.C.
Heidi, welcome back to The Take. Thank you for helping us begin this conversation by centering it on the people who will be most affected. As of 12:01 a.m. on Wednesday, the U.S. federal government officially shut down. And the last time that happened was at the end of 2018 during Trump's administration, the first one, and it lasted 35 days. So for those of us who weren't there or who do not remember that time period, can you explain just what a federal government shutdown entails?
A federal government shutdown can happen every year if Congress doesn't do its job. And it's not doing it right now. This is because at the end of September is the end of the fiscal year in the United States. And so all of the bills that approve the budget for all of the federal programs, almost all the federal programs, that approval for spending money ends on September 30th. So come October 1st, as has happened this year, if you don't have a new approval, then legally speaking, you cannot fund the federal government. And so it shuts down. But of course, it can't completely shut down because we have the military, we have federal law enforcement, we have people who need retirement benefits. So there are portions that remain operational, but the workers, those federal workers who are propping up, just the bare skeleton that is required to keep the federal government limping along, those workers are not receiving a paycheck until Congress eventually does reopen the government.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so let's talk about some of those people, because beyond the political fights on Capitol Hill and this question of who will blink first to get the government back to work, there are real consequences for millions of Americans, including the 2 million federal workers this is impacting. Mm-hmm. So who is still at work and who is not?
Right. So 750,000 people are not at work. They are being forced to not go to work. And many of them are coming from the education department. 90% of that labor force has been furloughed. The labor department, 75% of the people who work there. So those are the workers who are told to stay home. And then, of course, there are those essential workers who still have to report to duty. We're talking about the security check officers, the TSA agents in airports, members of the military, and then Homeland Security, and also people who enact deportations, border patrol, et cetera. And the vast majority of them are not receiving a paycheck until ... There's no date. They can't plan because it all depends on when Congress, again, will come together and pass this funding legislation.
There's so much in that ... right? Because if anyone who's listening or watching has ever felt the cringe, the uncomfortable weight of waiting for that next paycheck to either pay their rent, their mortgage, to buy groceries, to buy school things for their kids, they know just how awful that feeling is. And this is not just Washington, D.C., where, of course, the heart of the government is. It's across the country, right? Because the federal government employs people all across the nation.
You know, given how high inflation is in the U.S. since the pandemic, and given the tariffs, all of these things, the expense of living has grown. So it's even harder on these federal workers this time around, arguably, than it was last time in the last government shutdown. And people who, live paycheck to paycheck, and the federal government does not pay well compared to like the private sector. So these are people who've already, in a sense, make a sacrifice to be federal workers and use their talents in that aspect. Now they're living with this uncertainty and having to stretch whatever savings they may have. And if they can't, then they just have to deal with those consequences.
Mm. Well, Heidi, I know you were walking the streets of Washington, D.C. You were outside the Capitol on the first full day of the shutdown, and you were talking to people about what the shutdown means for them. You met several people. You met a group of students who had come to the nation's capital on a school trip.
Yeah, fifth graders from Springdale Elementary in Macon, Georgia. They make an annual trip to the nation's capital to supposedly learn about how our federal government works. In this case, it's how it isn't working. And so they were turned away from the Capitol. They were supposed to go inside for a tour. All of their plans had to be changed. And I spoke with their school principal. And she said, this is about adults not knowing how to budget, those members of Congress. And it's also about learning that there are different versions of the story.
What we always tell the kids, there's three sides: their side, our side, whatever side, and then there's our side somewhere in the middle.
The problem is no one is finding that middle ground at this moment to, reach an agreement to reopen Congress. So the kids are still learning something out of this trip.
Very important lesson there, if a hard one. Okay, so let's talk about finding that middle ground, because the government shut down because Trump's Republican Party, despite having majorities in both chambers of Congress, couldn't get enough Democrats to vote with them to continue funding the government. Why are the Democrats holding out?
The Democrats are paying attention to health care. That is their hill that they're willing to die on at this point. They want Republicans to agree to an additional $1 trillion in spending to extend the current subsidies that about 20 million Americans are receiving to afford their health insurance. That was a remnant from the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and actually was something introduced during the pandemic, and that Americans have really learned to depend on to afford their health insurance premiums. So those premiums are set to double if Congress doesn't agree to extend the tax subsidies.
Wow.
So Democrats are pointing to that, saying that people simply won't be able to afford to buy health insurance if Republicans don't relent and agree to an additional $1 trillion in spending. That is what the Democratic version of reopening the government looks like. They want Republicans to agree to the spending to extend the help to Americans who need to afford their health insurance. And Democrats want to undo what Trump accomplished back in his big, beautiful bill a few months ago. They passed that, and that cut Medicaid significantly.
Okay, I can imagine people listening and watching this and thinking, why would someone want Americans' premiums for health insurance to go up? Because that would be bad for either party, right? But Trump and other Republicans are accusing Democrats of closing the government because they want to give free health care to undocumented immigrants. And even if Democrats wanted to, these provisions they're fighting for are just for those who have documents. They are not for undocumented immigrants. So how do you see this claim, this back and forth over this issue in the grand scheme of Trump's policy agenda?
Yeah, that Republican claim that this would somehow help undocumented immigrants is just plain out false. But it's been repeated over and over again. Because, the Republican base has really approved of Trump's handling of immigration and his cracking down on undocumented immigrants. And so they're really trying to tie these things together that are unrelated. Democrats have been trying to get the truth out there that what they want to include in their version of reopening the government has nothing to do with giving health care to undocumented immigrants because, as you accurately said, they're ineligible for this type of government help. But the statement, the false narrative is already out there. And Democrats, as they have been throughout this Trump administration, find themselves trying to, correct the record, but starting in a position that's already been degraded by these falsehoods.
We'll have more with Heidi after the break.
Up to 100,000 children go missing in China every year, a number that links back to the 1970s and the one-child policy. This story is about one of those children and the mother who spent decades searching for him. What's happening to China's children? Hear the full story on True Crime Reports.
Well, Heidi, this is not Americans' first rodeo when it comes to federal shutdowns, unfortunately. In the last 50 years, there have been 21 shutdowns. But what's raising alarms for people this time around is what Trump wants to do with this one.
Workers across the government are also concerned after President Trump threatened to make permanent mass firings in programs that don't align with his priorities.
At this point, it is almost silly to ask, can he do that? So let's sit with that for a little bit. What government services and protections is Donald Trump trampling on if he does that?
Yeah, for the first time in the history of government shutdowns, he says that some of these jobs that are going away is not just temporary, but permanent. And he is particularly targeting what he calls democratic agencies. So we can assume that means the EPA, could be more State Department related programs. And Trump has been, in a sense, touting that he does have this power, which in a government shutdown, the president does have more of these powers to make these cuts potentially permanent. He's calling it an unprecedented opportunity. And we've already seen this occur. And it's very clear he's doing so because of politics. And he's not shy to, really twist the knife and take ownership of that.
How many federal workers do you plan to lay off?
Well, we may do a lot, and that's only because of the Democrats. The last person that wants it shut down is us now. With that being said, we can do things during the shutdown that are irreversible, that are bad for them and irreversible by them, like cutting vast numbers of people out, cutting things that they like, cutting programs that they like.
He is using this to say that Democrats are to blame for this. And, we're looking at the midterm elections in about a year's time in the U.S., when the makeup of Congress could be reshuffled. And Trump is really trying to stack more chips against the Democrats and sell this narrative to the public that it's that party that is to blame for the shutdown. Whether or not it's legal, using official government agency websites and official responses from government employees to lay this very obviously politically driven narrative, we don't know whether that's legal. And there are already legal challenges out there that saying this is an abuse of power, that you're using official government resources to very nakedly pursue a political agenda that hasn't been tested before.
Well, Heidi, on top of these proposed layoffs, we are also dealing with this figure that we've become really used to discussing here in the United States. It's one that you mentioned earlier. It is the unpaid essential worker. And in this case, we're looking at people like air traffic control, the military, law enforcement, border patrol. These are all people who are expected to still show up to work with no pay until the government reopens. And we've seen in the past that if that shutdown runs too long, workers stop coming. They call in sick. Life happens. They have to take other jobs. So what do you think it means that so many parts of the government are run by people who could be here one day and gone the next?
Well, for those people themselves, this is their very livelihoods that are at stake. It's their houses, their mortgage, their payments for their kids' tuition, their food. And really, it depends on how long this government shutdown drags on. Last time, when it lasted for 35 days, we saw middle-class families standing in bread lines in the U.S. That was horrendous for a lot of people to witness in this country. So if this current shutdown drags on for a few days, maybe a couple weeks, maybe people can bounce back. But if it continues for a month longer, then we're going to see consequences that we just really haven't witnessed before. And then, of course, there's the long-term impact of this, because it's not stable to be a federal worker in the United States anymore. That has been proven true since Trump retook office, and of course in these government shutdowns. And so you have to wonder that in the future, are people going to want to work for the federal government? Is it still going to be able to attract the best and brightest minds, who have a heart for civic service? People might not choose that anymore, knowing that there's not even a guarantee of getting your paycheck on time.
Well, full disclosure, as someone who used to work for the U.S. federal government at Voice of America, that used to be the thing that was the enticement, this stable job that you could keep forever as long as you showed up and did the work.
That's right.
And that's no longer true. Well, many federal employees saw this coming. On Tuesday, 2 unions sued the Trump administration over its plans to fire federal employees over the shutdown, and they called the threats immoral and unlawful. Can you tell us more about how employees are reacting?
This is an unprecedented step that Trump is taking to use this opportunity of a shutdown to potentially fire workers. So there's a lot of outstanding questions to that. Is it just a threat that he's using to get Democrats to relent and reopen the shutdown? Or is he really going to enact these mass firings? And if that happens, how massive are we talking about? Tens of thousands? And I mean, this is why those unions are so worried about it, because no one knows truly where this is heading and whether or not Trump is bluffing. And so if these firings do take place, then, these lawsuits will also continue behind the scenes. But we know the legal mechanisms are very slow. And even in, Trump's mass layoffs through DOJ, since he took office, the courts have weighed in multiple times, either undoing the firings or requiring people to be hired back, or then going back again. And it's just such a whiplash.
Well, finally, Heidi, as we mentioned earlier, there have been 21 shutdowns in the last 50 years. And it almost feels at this point like this is just something we as Americans do every couple of years. So I want to ask you a question that I know people might be asking themselves, and those of our international audience very likely are asking themselves. Shouldn't there be a better way to do this? Haven't U.S. leaders learned any lessons? What's your take?
Wow, that's a great question. Every year Congress has to get it together at least once to keep the government running. That is the bare minimum responsibility of having those jobs. And when Congress was given that duty back in the 70s, it was specifically to empower Congress in order to make these choices once a year. But it was dependent on that the two parties would at least be able to compromise on this one essential thing to keep the government open. But through the last few decades, we've seen any sort of, working together among the two parties. We've seen a steady erosion of that. Now all we see is the vitriol. We see the memes. We see so many lines now crossed, and we see no negotiations happening. So the premise that the Congress can compromise for the good of the country to do this essential thing of keeping the government funded every year, that premise perhaps should not exist anymore, given the evidence that they are failing to reach those compromises.
Heidi, thank you for walking us through this really important issue. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Malika.